Okay, today we're going to talk about the quadratic formula. The quadratic formula is what we use when everything else has failed. So if it's a simple case, you could just stick the square root of both sides. If it's factorable, you could use the factoring rules and techniques. But quadratic formula works in all cases, and there's going to be many cases where the other ones don't work, and you will have to use the quadratic formula. So it's really important to know what the quadratic formula is. So this is what it looks like. It is ax squared plus bx plus c is equal to 0. And it's really important that this thing equals 0. If it doesn't, well, you have to solve it for 0 first, and I'll show you an example later on how to do that. Or it could look like this. Y equals ax squared plus bx plus c. And by simply choosing y to be 0, which you're allowed to do, you have the same case. So if you have a y equals, it doesn't matter. You can just pick y to be 0. So we need ax squared plus bx plus c. And here's what it says your answers are, your solutions or your roots. X is equal to the opposite of b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac, and all of that over 2a. So looks ugly, but we're going to break that apart so you can see how to actually make this work. So I'm going to rewrite this just a little bit. So we have, nope, I don't want to write that. I'm going to first write the x squared plus x plus equals 0. And I'm going to use some colors here. So A is whatever's here. B is whatever's here. And C is whatever's here. Now, once you identify those numbers, we're going to do the same thing over here. X is equal to the opposite of, we get a plus or minus, a square root symbol, a square, a minus, a 4, and then we get a 2 on the bottom, and then we fill in those letters. So everywhere you see an A, whatever this number is right here, is also going to appear here and here. And wherever you see a B, which is right here, will appear here and here. And whatever your C is, which is right here, will also appear right here. So you're literally just plugging in those numbers. So the first step is to identify what A, B, and C are. And I cannot emphasize how important it is this must equal 0, or you will not be able to see what A, B, and C are. Once you identify A, B, and C, you're going to plug it in, and then you can just start simplifying or using a calculator. So let's do this with an example. Let's say that we have x squared. I'm going to make that in black. Let's say we have x squared plus 2x plus 5 is equal to 0. So I first have to identify A, B, and C. A is the number before x. It's missing here, so it's going to be the number 1. Because remember, 1 times anything is that same thing. So A is 1. B is the number before x, so it's 2. And C is the number that's by itself. In this case, it's 5. So we have A is 1 because it's before x squared. B is 2 because it's before x. And C is the number by itself, so in this case, it's 5. And we're going to plug it in here. So it says our solutions are the opposite of whatever B is. In this case, it was 2. Plus or minus square root. Again, B was 2, so we got 2 squared minus 4. And then A is 1, so we'll plug in a 1 there. Remember, this is all multiply. 4AC means 4 times A times C. And C was 5, so we'll plug it in there. And then all of this over 2 times A, and again, A was 1. Now, the question is how do you simplify this? One option is you can plug it all in your calculator, but you got to be really careful with parentheses. But it's not that bad, especially if you start doing what's underneath here first. So let's do under the square root first. 2 squared is 4. 4 times 1 is 4. 4 times 5 is 20. With the minus, this becomes minus 20. And while we're here on the bottom, let's clean this up. 2 times 1 is 2. And with a little subtraction, 4 minus 20 is negative 16. So it says x is equal to negative 2 square root of negative 16. All over 2. And there's a plus or minus here. Now, if you remember from earlier, you can't have a square root of a negative number. Those are imaginary and they have no real solutions. So this has no real solution. So you're going to stop right here. Anytime you see a square root of a negative, stop right here and you just write no real solutions. And when you get to Algebra 2, they'll show you how to finish this, but we're not going to do it in Algebra 1. So just write no real solutions. And that brings up an interesting point. This thing underneath the square root is going to tell you whether or not you have real or imaginary solutions. So we have three options. If it ends up being negative, like the case we just said, there's going to be no real solutions. And like I just said a minute ago, they will be imaginary, but we'll deal with that in Algebra 2. What if this thing is positive? Could we keep doing it? And the answer is of course. And with this plus or minus, there ends up being two real solutions. So if this thing is positive, and the thing I'm talking about is b squared minus 4ac, if it's positive, we'll have two real solutions. And there's one other case, and that's if it's equal to 0. And if it's equal to 0, we do something plus 0 and something minus 0. That ends up being the same thing because this whole thing will vanish, and there ends up being one real solution. So as long as this part, b squared minus 4ac, is either 0 or positive, you can finish it and you'll have solutions. If it's negative, just write no real solution and you're done. And it has a name. So b squared minus 4ac, this is called the discriminant. And it's called the discriminant because it discriminates between whether or not you have no real solutions, two real solutions, or one real solutions depending on the answer. So this is called the discriminant. So let's do another case, preferably something that will give us a positive solution. So I think I'm going to use this same setup again, but I want to change c to be the opposite sign. So this time I'm going to make it -5. So here's our new problem, x squared plus 2x minus 5. And again, we need to identify a, b, and c. A is still 1, b is still 2. But in this case, c is -5. And make sure that this minus stays with the 5. So c is -5. And we're going to plug these in here. So I got x is equal to opposite of, and instead of b, we're going to put in 2. Plus or minus the square root. Again, here's b. So I'm going to plug in 2 again. We get 2 squared. Minus 4. A was 1. C was -5. And all this is over 2 times a, which was 1. Now, we're going to again start by simplifying underneath the square root. So we get -2 plus minus. And then 2 squared is 4. Because 2 times 2 is 4. Over here I got 4 times 1 is 4 times 5 is 20. But I have a negative times a negative, and a negative times a negative makes a positive, so this is going to be plus. And then down here I have 2. And then to clean it up just a little bit more, we can add this up. We get 4 plus 20 is 24, so we have -2 plus or minus the square root of 24 over 2. Now, if you needed a approximate answer, this is where you would plug it in your calculator. And here's what you're going to plug in. You're going to write, very carefully, parentheses, -2 plus square root 24, close the parentheses, divide 2. That'll give you a decimal. Then you're going to do it a second time, this time going with the minus symbol. Square root of 24, divide 2. And I'm going to grab a calculator really quickly, and I'll do it myself, so you can check your answers. Sorry, my calculator shut off. I'm getting it back up. Alright, here we go. So I got parenthesis, -2 plus square root is often with the x squared button, 24, close the parentheses. And I'm going to divide that answer by 2. And the answer is 1.449, so I'm going to round it to 1.45. So for the top one, the answer was x is equal to 1.45. And then we're going to do the same thing with the bottom one. This time we're going to change that plus symbol to a minus symbol and do the whole problem over again. And this time I get a negative answer, and I get x is equal to negative 3.449, so I'm going to round it to 45. So we expected to get two answers because our discriminant was positive. I did get two answers. If you left it like this, I would accept it for now. But notice that you can get decimal answers if you want to know about what it is. So it's about 1.5, and it's about negative 3.5. So let's do a couple more cases and just show you what this can look like, because this is always going to be the same setup. So let's go just make it up some numbers here. Let's say we get 3x squared minus 4x plus 3. And we'll make that equal to 0. So a ends up being 3. B ends up being negative 4. Make sure this stays with it. This is b. C is positive 3. And we're going to plug it in. So it's remember, it's the opposite of b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. So we're going to plug it in, and I get b is negative 4. Negative was already here, and b is negative 4, plus or minus the square root of negative 4. Make sure you put that one in parentheses. Minus 4, a was 3, c was 3. And then this is all over 2 times 3. So negative 4, double negative becomes a positive, so this is simply 4, plus or minus. Negative 4 squared is positive 16. 4 times 3 is 12. 12 times 3 is 36. And I'll finish the bottom. I can already see there's a problem. 6 times 3 is 6. And when I subtract this, 16 minus 36, we end up getting negative 20. And if you remember from earlier, this is not going to work. This is going to be no real solutions. So let's change it up so I have one that will work, and we're going to make this plus 3 into a negative 3. Now we'll make it a negative 3 out front. I changed my mind. So we'll change this to a negative, which will make this negative 3. And let's do our problem over again. So in this case, we have a is negative 3, b is negative 4, and c is 3. So let's plug it in. We get negative 4 plus minus the square root of, in parentheses, negative 4 squared minus 4. A is negative 3. C is positive 3. This is all over 2 times negative 3. So just like I was saying, negative 4 would become positive 4. Under here, 4 squared is still 16, so negative 4 squared is also 16. 4 times 3 is 12. 12 times 3 is 36. But now I have negative times positive, and negative times negative is a positive, so this becomes plus. And on the bottom, 2 times negative 3 is negative 6. Next thing I'm going to clean up is this right here. We're going to just simply add it up. So we get 4 plus or minus the square root of 6 and 6 makes 12. 3, 4, so this is 52 over negative 6. And then generally you don't leave the negative here. We're going to move it up here. This doesn't change because a plus becomes a minus becomes a plus. So this would be negative 4 plus or minus the square root of 52 over 6. And then this is where you would put it in your calculator and check your work. So I do want to show you what would happen if, for instance, this does not equal to 0, because sometimes that happens and you have to do a little solving. So first off, let's say it's y equals 2x squared plus 3x minus 5. You would simply make this to 0 and do the same thing. So a is 2, b is 3, and c is negative 5. But what happens if you have something else? So let's say that you have x squared plus 8x plus 60 is equal to negative 8x minus 4. So the first thing you'd have to do to both sides is you want to make this equal to 0. So everything over here we're going to get rid of and move it over here with the side with the x squared. So just like before, how do you get rid of a minus 4? You add 4. Now over here I got 3 to choose from. You got to decide on the like terms. 4 is not like x squared. 4 is not like x, but 4 is like 60 because neither has a variable. So we'll add the 4 right here. And we're going to do the same thing with negative 8x. The opposite of negative 8 is plus 8. So we're going to add 8x. It's not like the 60. It's not like the x squared, but it is like this 8x. So we're going to add it right here. On the right-hand side, negative 8x plus 8x is 0. Negative 4 plus 4 is 0. So this thing equals 0, which is what we were trying to make happen. Over here, the x squared has no match, so it stays x squared. 8x plus 8x is 16x. And 60 plus 4 is 64. And let's identify a, b, and c and use our quadratic formula. A is the number before x squared, so it's 1. B is the number before x, so it's 16. And c is the number by itself, so it's 64. And we're going to plug these in. So I got negative b is 16 plus minus the square root. B squared is 16 squared minus 4. A is 1. C is 64. And this is all over 2 times a, which is 1. So we get negative 16 out front. And this is where a calculator might come in handy. So I'm going to turn my calculator back on because I do not know what 16 times 16 is. But using my calculator, it tells me it's 256. So this is 256. And then 4 times 64, I don't know that one either. So 4 times 64 using a calculator is also 256. So this is 256. And on the bottom, we get 2 times 1. Now, on the top, we're going to subtract this. 256 minus 256 is 0. So I get negative 16 plus or minus the square root of 0 over 2 times 1 is 2. Square root of 0 is still 0 because 0 times 0 is 0. So if I do negative 16 plus 0, I get negative 16. If I do negative 16 minus 0, I get negative 16. So this is just negative 16 over 2, which is equal to negative 8. So in this case, I have one answer, negative 8, and that's because the discriminant ended up being 0. So the rest of it just went away. So it doesn't matter what you do, as long as you get x to equal 0 first. So if it's equal to a y, just make y 0. If it's equal to anything else, add or subtract to move it over so it's 0. Identify a, b, and c. Plug them into the quadratic formula, and then carefully use a calculator to get down to a single number if the discriminant is 0. You should have 2 real numbers if the discriminant, this thing under the square root, ends up being positive. And if this thing is negative, just write no real solution because you can't do that. If you have questions, please make sure you ask.